As I was asked to be a discussant of your presentation, I was a little bit embarrassed. There's a clear case of conflict of interest, as you can also see from. But I come from the country of conflict of interest. Part of my identity to implement it. That makes me. The task is hard, so what I can do is just make a quick series of reflections. Very quick, I think the most interesting thing would have to have a discussion, which is mostly on a few points that I think are useful from the management of organizational theory point of view. So I think there's an obvious question one might ask. One is very simple. Organizational theory and management have already such a hard time in using standard mathematics to do their job. Why should we go into more abstract and hard mathematics to do it? And my answer would be exactly for that very reason. I think that the reason that makes it so hard to use sometimes conventional maths to our job is that many of the problems we find are of a different nature, right? And it's interesting to move our search for tools that enable us to express, basically in a more formal way, what is typical of much work in management, which is of a conceptual nature. We deal a lot with concepts, we deal a lot with representations, but we don't have a rich language for expressing those things. So in one first important sense, it's useful to explore those tools as a way to address issues which are traditionally considered as a province of qualitative reasoning that no formal tool may address. There are such tools. I think it's interesting to start exploring them. Right? So I think it's very important to say that I think we need more abstractions, not less abstractions in our field, just to address the qualitative nature of much reasoning in management. I think there were some very interesting examples. Right? The second issue is what can you do with such tools, right? Because of course you don't get the usual type of results you will get from a mathematical model. So it's an important question, which kind of reasoning can you carry on with these things, right? Of course you can give ways to clean the way you reason about some representation issue, right? There's a lot of confusion sometimes about it. So let me give you a simple example. A very, very popular tool in representing strategy that had a huge diffusion last year is related to what they call the sort of blue ocean strategy and the strategy canvas. Many of you have seen it. It looks very much like the representation Jürgen used, right? But there's a lot of confusion about how people reason about it in the book, for example. There's a huge confusion between what is added by adding features, which is of course offering to your, for example, customers more features that can add value, to adding possibilities, right? That's not the case. As it's clear, once you start reasoning in this way, adding features does not increase possibility. It actually decreases the number of possible configurations you can consider. So there's a lot of confusion between adding features, which of course can add value to the consumer, to adding possibilities to you in terms of combination you can create. This is wrong reasoning, which is induced by a lot of confusion about how you reason about those things. Introducing a more rigorous language to think about those things can have a very strong hygienic reason, I think, to help us go through these things in a more coherent way. Let me make a quick quote from Spivak, a mathematician, to introduce another point, diagrammatic reasoning. A graphic has the power to evoke feelings of understanding without really meaning much, right? That's a typical problem all of us have with management reasoning. There's a lot of diagrammatic thinking that ends up basically in a sort of illusion of understanding. Category theory, for example, offers some very sharp tools for making this kind of diagrammatic reasoning more rigorous. To, for example, use it both for deriving some important conclusions that you can do by chaining, for example, different kind of arrows and so on. And at the same time, by excluding things you can't do, right? So once more, I think it's interesting, I think, for our community to think more about diagrammatic reasoning and how you can use it as a tool for making sort of reasonable inferences out of what you know. And I think this is a very interesting task for this kind of tools. Maybe you have to find new and different applications, but it's quite clear that they open up an opportunity to make diagrammatic reasoning a real tool for being rigorous about errors. We all make jokes about the use of errors in management, but errors are a conceptual, powerful conceptual tool if used properly. If used improperly, of course, they produce monsters. Two quick points. One has already been made by Jürgen, I think, is the point of understanding better what we mean by coherence. Right? There has been a lot of work in issues like business models and other things about what makes a set of policies, a business model, coherent, right? Where coherent is left totally unspecified. Usually it's some sense that things should go together, right? Here we have a nice tool to start making this notion of coherence of a business model, well, very simple and sound and understandable. And it's all about, and I think this ability to provide tools that can let you formally reason on the interaction between what is locally compatible and globally compatible is extremely useful for thinking about most management problems, where this local, global incompatibility or compatibility arises all the time. Think to discussion, for example, in the strategy literature on activity systems, right? A very popular issue, right? They are basically a very naive way to address these kind of issues. How can you make a globally compatible system of locally compatible features or activities, right? So it's a nice language to carry, in my view, to the surface problems that have been very vaguely addressed in the literature. The last problem, which I find very interesting, is the problem of generativity, right? That only implicitly surfaced in the discussion by Jürgen. I think one thing we never do enough is what kind of reasoning we are interested in the case of management, right? And I think we should learn more from linguistics sometimes and less from physics, right? I think there's a lot that happens in organizations and management which has a generative nature, in the sense that given a set of resources and rules, the ability to generate new entities, new objects, right, is a fundamental thing that we observe each day. We observe it in organizational design, you observe it in innovation, right? That doesn't mean that given an initial state you can predict what will come out. It means that given a set of objects, resources, relations, you can define a set of things that might happen. And of course there are strong, subjective, creative components that we cannot analyze this way, but at least you can give a sort of grammar of things that may happen. I think you can derive even a certain initial state of representations and think that cannot be obtained unless you introduce new ones and combine them with appropriate operator. You can say, in a way, what can be combined, which kind of grammar makes, like in the amalgamation example that was made very shortly given the extreme time constraints, but once you analyze in detail, you can have very powerful tools for defining what can be done, what can't be done by doing such a thing, which kind of constraints you introduce, another thing you're doing, and so on. So I think given a sort of more generative idea of how we can play with mental representation, with strategy representation, is a very interesting opportunity in using this kind of tools. And actually, Jürgen just defined a few operators you can imagine to define this sort of generative structure of a representation, which observe all the time when business innovations are introduced. So I'm fully actually, as I told you, getting into my conflicts of interest. I'm not providing really a critical discussion of Jürgen, what you've been told, but just an attempt to add to it somewhat a natural translation, in my view, in what are important problems in our community, right? To summarize, redefining clearly a qualitative thinking as an opportunity for formalization, not an area we cannot. The possibility of redefining more clearly coherence and making some sort of hygienic effort in thinking about the coherence of our representation, learning from what we can do and use from diagrammatic reasoning in a more reasonable and formal way, and finally thinking more in terms of generative possibilities of our representation rather than just the sort of reasoning about the traditional view of how you could make, how would I say, prediction for an initial state. Right? And I think these are, in my view, very interesting avenues that might change the way we work in a way on our theories, and that might have also very interesting practical implications for management. Sorry to be longish and to be so adherent to the spirit of the talk rather than critical, but how could I do?